Okay, everyone. I put some long videos in the module this week, so I'm going to keep these lectures to a very short little bit. In Chapter 3, the part I want to talk a little bit about is here later on in the chapter where they're talking about World War II and the post-1973, as I have highlighted here. Okay, so the World War II ended up being, in a very perverse sense, rather good for our economy. The post-war boom saw all of the GIs come back home. People had put off their lives for not just the 5 years that war was going on, but you have to remember that the Great Depression was before that. So there were 15 years worth of delayed family starting, delayed consumption, and 15 years of people learning to be very frugal with their money. Furthermore, while the war was on, all those soldiers were getting paid, but it's hard to spend much money in a war zone. So their accounts were getting a little bit full. When people came back from the war, there was some concern that that the Great Depression would start back up again, because all of these soldiers and warriors would come home and want their jobs back, and there weren't enough jobs to go around. However, a couple of things did happen. As part of returning home, the government had the GI Bill, which was a massive stimulus program to send all of those GIs off to college, which was definitely good for higher education. Higher education grew by leaps and bounds for that period. That was the first thing. The second thing was all of our competitors' economies were in ruins. So Europe had to be rebuilt. Japan had to be rebuilt. Russia had certainly some issues and some towns that needed to be rebuilt. And in that period of time, we were the only ones that had good, solid factory system still intact. So as the rest of the world begins to rebuild, we're the ones who are supplying that. The Americans are, the American factories. And through this tremendous stimulus, the government sends people into schools, the schools grow, and then, not only that, but you've also got all of that delaying of starting families and such, and servicemen coming home and going to work. The next thing they're doing is they're hooking up because they can now, and they're having babies because they can now. And as they do that, they begin the tremendous wave of the suburban build-out and the baby boom that comes after that. Because what happens after you come home from the war, settle down, and get married? Well, you start pumping out kids. So the suburban build-out takes off then too. So you've got this huge wave of suburban growth, including all the infrastructure that has to get built around that. All of the people who hadn't started their lives, starting their lives, and then having children, and then themselves going to college, and then having children. And the baby boom was so large that huge infrastructures have to be built for these kids at every level. The neighborhoods for the suburban build-out have to get built, but then the schools have to get built, and then the colleges, which went through such a big growth spurt in the post-war era, in the GI Bill era, they too have to grow again because now the baby boomers are old enough to go to college. So in that period of, say, 1945 up until roughly 1970, the economy grows by leaps and bounds. It grows so much, it's almost like an order of magnitude. It grows to a different level, so that whatever government debt was down here, whatever personal debt down here, things grew so much here that this debt didn't matter at all. Yeah, there you go. Okay, now, when 1973 happens, and I don't really know what the date is, or a time that we can start talking about it, but you can start to see friction early in the 60s with the Civil Rights Movement. The Civil Rights Movement was obviously the right thing to do and a good thing to do, but there was a lot of disagreement. And by the time we get to the late 60s, it wasn't, that cultural conflict, which we still have with us today, we call the culture wars, the cultural conflict between the traditionalists and those who wanted to be progressive, for lack of a better word, had continued. So by 1968, you have in '69, you have the Summer of Love. The hippies are coming along. Vietnam had been going for a while, and clearly there was not consensus on whether Vietnam was a good thing or not. So there was a certain amount of friction that was built into the economy at that time, or at least the political sphere at that time. The other thing is, in 1973, I don't know if it was 1973 or if it was maybe just a year or two before that, but in the early 70s, the U.S. became a larger importer of foreign oil than exporter. We passed that 50% line. And what happened when we passed that 50% line is all of a sudden the nations in the Middle East who didn't like us that much and who were still mad about World War II and Israel, they realized they had a little bit of leverage. Not only they didn't have a little bit of leverage, they had a lot of leverage. So 1973, you have the first oil shock. You have another one again in 1978. Both of those were political, but they had deep effects on the economy. Also note, we're about 35 years after World War II. So all of our competitors' economies and factories are back in full swing. And if you think about the 70s and 80s, some of those that we were in competition with actually were doing very, very well. In the 80s, Japan's economy was booming. There was a certain amount of concern about the rise of Japan, which nowadays you hear more in terms of the rise of China, because China has grown so much. Germany didn't take too long for them to get their production back in line, so that by the 70s and 80s they're making wonderful, wonderful products that the world is consuming. So by the 70s, that boost that we had from the post-war era had started to wane. Demographically, the baby boomers had made it to college and were just about to enter the workforce. That meant that everyone behind them, Gen X, actually shrank behind the baby boom. So as Gen X is being born in the 60s and in the mid 60s and into the 70s and the very, very early 80s, you don't need as much in the schools. The schools are starting to face a little bit of shrinking. Like demographically, Gen X was small, so all this demand, we were on the back side of the wave, the Xers were, versus the boomers who were on the front side of the wave getting pushed. Okay, now those are some of the things that were going on. It's hard to say causally what one thing was causing another, and economic historians will still debate the different things that were going on. So the GI Bill, as the creator of post-war prosperity, there are people that are going to say that's what it was. They tend to be on the Democratic side of the aisle. There are people who will point out that, well, no, that's good enough. Yeah, there we go. So people will debate about what actually was causing these things. I'm not sure it's clear exactly what was causing these things, but all of these things were going on. So by the time you go from the 50s, the time of prosperity, oh, you know what else was going on in the 50s? We built the interstate highway system. We rebuilt the electrical grid, including lots and lots and lots of nuclear plants, including big dams out west to create power and water for Vegas and California. I mean, it was a period of doing huge things, and everybody's doing relatively well. Okay, but the 70s, everything changes. The economy slumps. The interest rates at first go very, very high, and then Volcker, the Fed chairman, steps in and clamps down so that I should say inflation was high in the 70s. So the inflation was very high. Volcker steps in, clamps down on interest rates, sending them up to, like 15% to buy a house. And at that time, then that drove down inflation. So inflation is tamed, but credit is very hard to come by. It wasn't. Let's see what else was going on. So interest rates were high. Inflation was a problem. People talked about it in terms of stagflation. You had the first and second oil shocks. Racial tensions that had begun to run into trouble by the late 60s were still going on into the 70s, so that you still have some of the riots and burnings in the 70s. You have the American Indian movement in the 70s getting shut down by the feds. Carter talked about a sense of malaise in the country. Now, the other thing that started to happen, and the thing that the book is talking about, is you also started to have a rethinking of the welfare programs in the United States. So that's why the book is pointing at 1973. In 1973, some of the supporting the middle class welfare programs were pulled out, and so that eventually we have a welfare system now which is supposed to just be a safety net. When everything gets so bad that you have to resort to eating cat food, you don't have to resort to eating cat food. But there was an idea, the Great Society coming out of the Great Depression and carried through the post-war era, made sure that if people were poor, they were at least supported up to a level of being middle class, and we got rid of that. So some of that wealth in the middle started to pull apart. And so ever since 1973, economic inequality has increased and gotten worse. Okay. That's good enough for now. Thank you.